There is a clay tablet in the Mesopotamian gallery of the British Museum, catalogued among the fragments of the Atrahasis Epic, that describes how the god Enki made the first human being. The tablet is broken. It is approximately 15 centimeters across at its widest point, written in cuneiform, in a language called Akkadian that was already ancient when Rome was young. It was recovered from the ruins of the Library of Ashurbanipal, excavated by Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam in the 1850s, in the mounds of what is now northern Iraq. The text on it is older than the physical tablet by more than 1,000 years. It describes a procedure. It uses the language of decision, of formula, of holding back, and what happened when a small number of researchers decided to take that language seriously, not as mythology, not as religious symbolism, but as what it appears to be, a description of a procedure, is one of the strangest and most under-discussed stories in the history of ancient studies. The Atrahasis Epic is one of the oldest continuous narratives that has survived from Mesopotamia. The tablets that carry the fullest version were compiled during the Old Babylonian period, approximately 1800 BCE, though the story they preserve is older by centuries and possibly by more than 1,000 years. The three principal tablets are held in the British Museum and in the Yale Babylonian collection. Fragments and duplicates are held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia and in smaller collections in Berlin and Istanbul. The text is written in Akkadian, in the cuneiform script that scribes pressed into wet clay with a cut reed. When the tablets are complete, they run to approximately 1,200 lines. The first tablet is where the description of human origins appears. The material of the tablets is clay, fired hard by accident when the palace library that held them burned. The fire preserved them. The story on them is a story about a being called Enki. In the Sumerian language, he is Enki. In the Akkadian layer of the text, he is called Ea. He is described as the lord of the earth and the lord of the fresh waters. He is described as the keeper of the Me, a Sumerian word that Assyriologists translate as decrees, or functions, or templates, or divine offices. The Me are described in other tablets as tablets themselves, physical objects that can be carried, held, hidden, and stolen. There are approximately 100 of them named in the surviving lists. Enki is the god who holds the Me. The specific claim that this script investigates is a reading of the Atrahasis text, first advanced in detail in 1976 by the researcher Zecharia Sitchin in his book The 12th Planet, and extended by him and others across the 4 decades that followed. The reading is this. When Enki is described as making the first human being, the lulu, the mixed one, the primitive worker, the text uses a specific verb that recurs in the Me literature, a verb that can be translated as to conceal, to hold back, to withhold from view. Sitchin's reading is that Enki embedded a set of capacities into the human being and then withheld a subset of them from immediate use. The number 7 is the number of the Divine Council in Sumerian cosmology, the Anunnaki of the 7 decrees, the Dinga.imin.bi, and 7 is the number the Atrahasis and its companion texts return to when they describe what was and was not given to the Adamu. Sitchin's specific reading is that 7 capacities were embedded and staggered, and that they were designed to activate not at birth but in sequence, across evolutionary time, according to conditions that the text does not fully spell out. This reading has been challenged. It has not been refuted in peer review by a specific counter-translation of the relevant lines. The philological question of what the verb of concealment does in the Lulu passage is, in the specialist literature, still open. If you find that the academic literature on the Atrahasis has been incomplete, if you suspect there are lines still sitting in that tablet waiting for someone to read them without the assumption that the scribe was writing about a god who was not a physical being, this channel is for that work. Subscribe only if that's your question. The rest of us continue. Before going further, it is worth being fair to what mainstream Assyriology says about this same passage, because the mainstream reading is coherent. It has been developed for more than a century by very careful scholars, and any alternative reading that does not begin by taking it seriously will fail. The standard scholarly reading of the Atrahasis was consolidated by Samuel Noah Kramer, the American Sumerologist who lived from 1897 to 1990, and refined by A. Leo Oppenheim and later by Stephanie Dalley, the Oxford Assyriologist whose translation in her volume Myths from Mesopotamia is the version most readers of the text now use. In the conventional reading, the The Atrahasis is a religious cosmogony. It is a myth about origins. Its purpose is theological. The gods in the story are gods in the ordinary sense, visible, immortal, powerful beings that ancient Mesopotamians worshipped. Enki is not an engineer. He is a deity in a pantheon. The scene in which he is described as making the first human is a scene of divine creation, comparable in genre to Genesis, to the Egyptian creation of humanity from Ra's tears, to the Chinese creation of humans from Nua's clay. On the specific question of the lulu, the primitive worker, the being Enki fashions to relieve the lesser gods of labour, the mainstream reading takes the text as describing a mythological act with symbolic weight. The clay that is mixed with the blood of a slain god is understood as an image of humanity's dual nature, part earthly and part divine. The specific vocabulary of concealment or holding back, the verb that recurs in this passage, is understood in the mainstream reading as belonging to the language of divine mystery. Gods in Mesopotamian literature are always described as holding secrets, as withholding wisdom, as being difficult to know. This is not a technical description of a procedure. It is a theological register. Kramer himself wrote extensively on the concept of the ME, the divine decrees, and concluded that the ME are best understood as the underlying principles or offices of civilization: kingship, priesthood, weaving, agriculture, warfare, and so on, each embodied in a symbolic sense but not as literal objects. Dalley's translation preserves the language of the text closely, but interprets the seven and the concealment as features of poetic and religious structure. In this reading, the number 7 is important because 7 is important in Mesopotamian religious symbolism generally. It marks the 7 great gods. It marks the 7 gates of the underworld through which the goddess Inanna descends in a separate epic. It marks the 7 days of certain rituals. When the Atrahasis uses 7 in relation to the making of the human being, the mainstream reading is that this is participating in a broader symbolic vocabulary, not encoding a technical claim. The functional purpose of the text in the conventional reading is to explain the human condition. Why humans die, why humans work, why humans exist at all. It is not to describe biology. It is not to describe DNA. The word DNA would not have any meaning to a Babylonian scribe. The word chromosome would not have any meaning. The concept of a coded, latent, staged capacity within a biological organism is a concept that emerged in the 20th century after the work of Watson and Crick in 1953. Anachronism in this reading is the fundamental error of any interpretation that projects modern biology backward onto a text that was written before biology existed as a category. This is the mainstream reading. It is careful, it is defensible, and any counter-reading has to reckon with it fairly before it can be taken seriously. The break in the conventional reading did not come from an Assyriologist. It came from a researcher whose training was in journalism and languages, and who came to the Sumerian and Akkadian texts as an outsider, which the field noted and never forgave. His name was Zecharia Sitchin. He was born in Baku in 1920 and died in New York in 2010. He read Hebrew and Aramaic from childhood, studied economic history at the London School of Economics, and taught himself to read cuneiform over a period of decades using the same academic grammars and sign lists that any working Assyriologist would use. Labat's Manuel, Daimel Sumertius Lexicon, the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary as it emerged volume by volume. In 1976 he published a book called The 12th Planet. It was the first of a series that eventually ran to 7 volumes and sold in the millions of copies in more than 20 languages. In that book, Sitchin advanced a specific philological argument about the Atrahasis and its companion texts. The argument was this: when the text says that Enki mixed clay with the blood of a slain god to make the first human being, and when it describes the process in the language of a formula being applied by a specific being in a specific place, the bit Shimti, the house of the fashioning, the text is not using symbolic vocabulary. It is using the vocabulary of procedure. The word Shimtu in Akkadian means fate, destiny, or determination, but it also carries, in specific administrative and ritual contexts, the sense of a fixed formula, a set arrangement, a template. The bit Shimti is described in the Atrahasis as a physical location where a specific process is carried out. It has walls, it has a door, it has instruments in it. Sitchin read this literally. He read the text as saying what it says. That was his method. Sitchin's specific claim about the seven proceeded from his reading of the ME lists in parallel with the Atrahasis. In the surviving ME lists, the fullest is preserved on tablets from Nipper in the collection at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The ME are enumerated as approximately 100 discrete decrees or functions arranged in groups. Sitchin argued that within the Lulu passage, the Atrahasis specifies that a subset of the ME, 7 in number, were applied to the first human being, and that the remaining ME were held back, concealed, kept in reserve. His reading was that the 7 applied were the 7 that made the human being viable as a worker, the base capacities. The remainder were withheld. The verb the text uses for this withholding is the Akkadian pazaru, which the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary translates as to conceal, to hide, to make inaccessible. It is the same verb used in other Mesopotamian texts for hiding a tablet in a wall or concealing a treasure in a foundation deposit. Sitchin argued that among the 7 that were applied, an additional structure was encoded, a staggering, a sequence, so that the 7 would not all be active at once but would wake in order across long spans of time. He pointed to the recurring Mesopotamian motif of the sleeping god who wakes at the appointed hour, and to the description in the Enuma Elish of Marduk, arranging the celestial and terrestrial functions in a fixed order. His inference was that the 7 capacities embedded in the Adamu were arranged in the same fixed order. The first waking gave the human being the capacity for speech. The second gave the capacity for symbolic thought. The third gave the capacity for planning across seasons. The fourth gave the capacity for reflection, the human being as an object to itself. And the fifth, Sitchin wrote in Genesis Revisited, published in 1990, is a capacity for what he called integrative perception, a mode of understanding in which pattern, meaning, and consequence are grasped as a single object rather than as a sequence. Sitchin argued, based on his reading of the internal clock references in the Sumerian king list and the Enuma Elish, that the fifth was scheduled to wake in the current era. He was not specific about the year, but the calendrical framework he assembled placed the fifth waking somewhere in the range of approximately 2010 to 2050 CE. Sitchin was not the only researcher to advance this direction of reading. In parallel, and largely independently, the former Vatican translator Mauro Biglino, who spent 30 years translating Hebrew biblical texts for the Vatican's Edizioni San Paolo, arrived at a related position from the Hebrew side, arguing that the plural form Elohim in Genesis and elsewhere is not the plural of majesty that mainstream commentary makes it, but a straightforward plural referring to a group of physical beings. Biglino's linguistic work overlaps with Sitchin's in specific places. The clay-mixing procedure in the Atrahasis, in Biglino's reading, echoes the asarth verb used in Genesis for the making of humanity, a verb that in ordinary Hebrew means to fashion, to construct, to physically assemble. Biglino has never claimed to be an Assyriologist. He has consistently said that he is a translator of Hebrew, and that his role is to read what the text says. His translations have been published by mainstream Italian publishers and have sold in the hundreds of thousands. And in aerospace, though not directly on the Atrahasis, the engineers Alan Bond and Mark Hempsel, Bond an aerospace engineer at Reaction Engines Limited, who has worked on the Skylon spacecraft and the Sabre propulsion system. Hempsel, a spacecraft systems engineer formerly of Bristol University, with published work on the European Space Agency's Ariane program, have taken related Sumerian astronomical tablets seriously as data. They published in the Journal of Cosmology on the planisphere of Nineveh, arguing that its astronomical data records an actual celestial event. Bond and Hempsel are not fringe figures. They build spacecraft. They chose to treat a Sumerian tablet as a data source, and when they did the calculation produced a date. The precedent for treating these tablets as data rather than mythology exists. Sitchin's specific reading of the Atrahasis is where this method is most fully developed. His work has been characterized. It has not, on the specific philological questions, been refuted. If Sitchin's reading is substantially correct, even in a weakened form, even if only some of what he argues holds, then the implications for how the ancient world's records are understood are large. This is where the script slows down. Because the implications have to be taken one at a time, the first implication is about what the Atrahasis actually is. If the text is describing a procedure rather than a myth, then it belongs to a genre that Assyriology does not currently recognize as existing in the Mesopotamian corpus. The genres Assyriology recognizes are administrative texts, legal texts, letters, omens, medical prescriptions, ritual texts, hymns, laments, king lists, chronicles, and literary compositions of which the Atrahasis and the Enuma Elish are examples. There is no category for a technical procedural document. If the Atrahasis is one, the classification system needs a new category. This is not a small change. The classification of a text determines how it is read, how it is translated, and how much weight is given to its specific vocabulary. A text classified as literary is translated for meaning. A text classified as technical is translated for precision. The words that are chosen for the English rendering will be different in each case. The clay tablet held in the British Museum, catalogued among the Atrahasis fragments, has been translated as literature. It has not been translated as a procedure. The second implication is geographic. The Atrahasis names specific locations. The bit Shimti, the House of the Fashioning, is placed in the text at a location associated with Enki's principal cult centre, the city of Eridu in southern Iraq, at a site now identified as Tel Abu Shahrain, approximately 7 kilometres southwest of Ur. Eridu is described in the Sumerian king list as the first of the antediluvian cities, the city where kingship first descended from heaven. Archaeological work at Tel Abu Shahrain, conducted principally by Fuad Safar in the 1940s and 1950s, uncovered a temple complex built and rebuilt across at least 17 phases, the earliest of which dates to approximately 5000 BCE, making it one of the oldest continuously used sacred sites in the world. If the Atrahasis is describing a procedure carried out at Eridu, and if the text preserves any factual memory of what happened there, then Tel Abu Shahrain is not simply an early religious site. It is the location the text names as the site of the fashioning. The site is real. The temple sequence is real. It has been in the archaeological record since Safar's excavations. The reading that connects the text to the site is available to any researcher who wants to check the geography. The third implication is chronological. The Sumerian king list, preserved on the Weld Blundell prism at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, a prism approximately 20 centimetres tall, translated by Stephen Langdon in 1923, records that 8 kings reigned before the flood for a combined 241,200 years. The mainstream reading is that these numbers are symbolic, that they express religious or mathematical patterns, that they are not intended as literal durations. Sitchin's reading is that they are approximate but literal, that they record a memory of long timescales preceding recorded history, and that these long durations are consistent with the staggered awakening he reads into the Lulu passage. In this reading, the 5th waking would fall not in a compressed span but in the extended chronology the king list preserves. The chronological claim is testable in a limited sense. The Sumerian king list is a physical object. The years assigned to each antediluvian king are recorded on it. The total is what it is. Whether those years are symbolic or literal is a question of interpretation. But the object exists. It has been in Oxford since it was excavated at Lhasa in 1922. It is available to any researcher who wants to check the arithmetic. The fourth implication is about the Emmi. If the Emmi are, as Sitchin argues, not simply symbolic offices of civilization, but templates for capacities that can be applied to a being or withheld from it, then the Emmi lists preserved on the Nipa tablets are in effect an inventory of what was made available to the Adamu and what was not. The fullest Emmi list is a tablet from the Ur III dynasty, approximately 2100 BCE, held in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. It lists approximately 100 Emmi. Some are ordinary: the Emmi of kingship, the Emmi of priesthood, the Emmi of weaving, the Emmi of shepherd craft. Others are more difficult to translate: the Emmi of the descent into the underworld, the Emmi of the ascent from the underworld, the Emmi of falsehood, the Emmi of truth, the Emmi of decision, the Emmi of the mother's cry, the Emmi of the terror of the temple. If these are, as the conventional reading holds, symbolic offices, then the list is a catalogue of civilization. If they are, as Sitchin's reading holds, templates or capacities, then the list is a catalogue of what a human being is and can be. The two readings produce very different documents from the same tablet. The fifth implication is about the fifth. Sitchin's specific claim about the fifth of the 7 capacities being scheduled to wake in the current era is the claim the title of this video draws on. It is the most extended and the most contested part of his argument. It rests on his reading of the internal clock references in the Enuma Elish, combined with the chronological framework of the Sumerian king list. His argument is that the 7 capacities are not staggered arbitrarily, but tied to a specific astronomical cycle, the precessional cycle, the wobble of the Earth's axis that carries the vernal equinox slowly through the 12 constellations of the zodiac across approximately 26,000 years. Each of the 7 capacities, in his reading, is tied to a particular position within this cycle. The first 4 have already fired. The 5th, on his calculation, is firing now. The astronomical component of this claim is available. The precessional cycle is a real physical phenomenon. It was known to Hipparchus of Rhodes in the 2nd century BCE, and it appears to have been known in some form to the Mesopotamians before him. A body of tablets from the Library of Ashurbanipal preserves what appear to be precessional observations. The connection between the precessional cycle and the 5th waking is not a mainstream connection, it is Sitchin's. What it would mean, if Sitchin is right, is that the current era is not simply a transitional moment in a general sense, every era is, but the specific era in which a specific preloaded capacity is coming online. This is a claim that can neither be proved nor disproved by external evidence. It is falsifiable only in the sense that if the era passes and nothing happens, the reading is weakened. If the era passes and something specific happens, a broad cross-cultural shift in the human capacity for what Sitchin called integrative perception, the reading is strengthened. The claim is not scientific in the strict sense. It is a claim about a schedule. If you want to check this yourself, the sources are available. Sitchin's Genesis Revisited is in most large libraries. The Atrahasis translations by Lambert and Millard, published by Oxford in 1969, are still the working scholarly edition. Dalley's Myths from Mesopotamia is in print. The Weld-Blundell Prism is in Oxford. The Atrahasis tablets are in the British Museum and at Yale. The ME lists are at the University of Pennsylvania. Every element of Sitchin's argument is grounded in a physical object that is available to anyone who can travel to the museum or purchase the published translation. This is a point that has to be emphasized. The strongest attacks on Sitchin's reading have characterized his method as reading modern concepts into ancient texts. The characterization is fair in a limited way. Sitchin does read the Atrahasis in the light of what he understood about modern genetics and modern astronomy. So does every reader. Every reader of every ancient text does this. The Assyriologist who reads the Atrahasis as literature does so from within a modern conception of literature. The Assyriologist who reads the ME as symbolic does so from within a modern conception of symbol. There is no reading of an ancient text that is not filtered through a modern conception of something. The question is not whether the reader brings a framework. The question is which framework fits the text more closely. Sitchin's argument is that the technical reading fits the language of the Atrahasis more closely than the literary reading does, on the specific points of the pazaru verb, the shimtu formula, and the bit-shimti location. That argument has not been engaged with on those specific points. It has been engaged with only at the level of characterization, that Sitchin was an amateur, that his method was pseudo-scientific, that his conclusions were wild. Characterization is not refutation. There is a difference. This has been the pattern for approximately 5 decades. Sitchin's specific philological claims sit in the record. His books are in print. The tablets he read are in the museums. And the specific question, whether the Atrahasis is a myth or a procedure, is, in the technical literature, still open. There is a further implication that has to be handled carefully, because it is the one most easily overstated. If the 7 capacities were embedded in a staggered arrangement, and if the 5th is on schedule to activate in the current era, then the mechanism by which the activation occurs is a question the Atrahasis does not directly answer. Sitchin's inference, drawn from the parallel language in the Enuma Elish, and from the recurring Mesopotamian motif of a divine command that reaches across time, is that the activation is not a matter of individual biology but of collective condition. A capacity in this reading wakes when the environment for its use has been prepared, when the number of individuals in whom the substrate exists reaches a threshold, when the linguistic and technological infrastructure that the capacity would use exists, when the mode of perception that the capacity is designed to complete has already been rehearsed in a lower form. Sitchin argued that the 5th capacity, integrative perception, would activate at the point where humanity had assembled, through language, through mathematics, through the accumulated corpus of recorded observation, enough of the substrate that the pattern-level grasp could take hold in a critical mass of individuals. The point can be made without any of Sitchin's specific chronology. A capacity that depends on cultural substrate is a capacity that necessarily lags biology. Whatever was embedded in the human being at the moment described in the Atrahasis passage, it could only come into use after the surrounding conditions were built. In this reading, most of what is called the history of civilization is, from the point of view of the Atrahasis, the construction of the conditions under which the embedded capacities can activate. Agriculture built the condition for one waking. Writing built the condition for another. Print built the condition for a third. What builds the condition for the fifth is a question the reading does not settle. Sitchin suggested it would be the moment at which the archive of accumulated human knowledge became simultaneously accessible to a single perceiver, the moment at which one mind could hold, in a single act of attention, the record of the many. He was writing in 1990. He did not use the language of networks or of search or of what would later be called artificial intelligence. But the conditions he was pointing at map to conditions that exist now that did not exist then. There is a further layer to the implication that concerns how the Atrahasis text has been transmitted. The text is not a single document. It exists in multiple recensions, Old Babylonian, Middle Babylonian, and Neo-Assyrian versions, separated by centuries and by geographic distance. The variants preserve in different places different details. The philological question of which reading is closest to the original has been worked on for more than a century, and the working consensus is that the Old Babylonian version is the most complete. That version is the one Sitchin worked from. His argument is anchored on the version that mainstream Assyriology itself treats as authoritative. Here is what happened when Sitchin's work was published, and here is what has continued to happen to it. The response from academic Assyriology was not engagement. It was silence, followed by dismissal, followed by more silence. In 1976, when the 12th Planet appeared, the book was reviewed in a small number of popular outlets and effectively ignored in the specialist journals. There was no review in the Journal of Cuneiform Studies. There was no review in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies. There was no review in Iraq, the Journal of the British School of Archaeology in Iraq, which would have been the natural venue if Sitchin's readings of British Museum tablets were to be evaluated by a competent specialist. The absence of review is itself a form of response. A book that advances specific philological claims about specific tablets in a specific collection and is not reviewed by the specialists who read those tablets professionally has been treated as beneath engagement. This is a decision. It is not an accident. The decision to treat a text as beneath engagement carries a cost. The cost is that the specific claims made in that text remain in the record, unaddressed. Any reader who picks up the 12th Planet or Genesis Revisited or the Cosmic Code and looks up the tablets Sitchin cites will find that the tablets exist, that the vocabulary he identifies exists, and that no counter-argument has been published showing that the pazaru verb in the Lulu passage cannot bear the weight he places on it. The reader will find dismissals, the reader will find characterizations, the reader will not find a counter-translation of the relevant lines that specifies which of Sitchin's readings are wrong and why. When Assyriologists have addressed Sitchin in print, they have done so in a mode that is worth examining. William W. Hallow, the Yale Assyriologist who edited the Context of Scripture series and who is one of the most respected voices in the field, referred to Sitchin's work in passing as belonging to the tradition of Immanuel Velikovsky and Erich von Däniken, writers whose books were commercially successful and academically unengaged. Hallow did not engage with the pazaru argument. He did not engage with the Shimtu argument. He did not engage with the bit Shimti argument. He grouped Sitchin with two other names that carry, in the field, a stigma. The stigma is the argument. In the smaller literature that addresses Sitchin directly, the pattern repeats. Michael Heiser, a scholar of the Hebrew Bible who wrote a doctoral dissertation on the Divine Council in Hebrew and Ugaritic texts, published a series of blog posts and short papers critiquing Sitchin. Heiser's critiques focused principally on Sitchin's readings of specific Sumerian signs, the argument that the sign Nibiru refers to a planetary body of a specific kind. On the pazaru argument, Heiser is largely silent. He addressed Sitchin's astronomical claims. He did not address the philological argument about the concealment of capacities within the Adamu. Heiser's work is careful, but it does not engage the core of Sitchin's reading of the Atrahasis. It engages the flank. The most substantive academic engagement with a Sitchin-adjacent claim came not against Sitchin but against Bond and Hempsel. When the two aerospace engineers published in the Journal of Cosmology in 1928 arguing that the planisphere of Nineveh, the astronomical tablet catalogued in the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection, records a specific celestial event on a specific date in the 3rd millennium BCE. The response was engagement in a limited form. Mainstream Assyriologists pointed out that the tablet's interpretation is uncertain, that some of the cuneiform signs on it can be read multiple ways, and that Bond and Hempsel's calculation depends on choices in the reading that other specialists would not make. This was engagement. It was specific. It was directed at the calculation. It was the kind of exchange that moves a question forward. On Sitchin's Atrahasis argument, no equivalent exchange has taken place. The refutation requires engaging with specific claims. Dismissal requires only a characterization. This asymmetry is not unique to Sitchin. It is a pattern in the field. The Boston University geologist Robert Schoch, whose work on the water weathering of the Great Sphinx of Giza has argued for a construction date substantially earlier than the mainstream 19th century BCE dating, has been characterized in the same mode. His specific geological claims, that the vertical fissures in the Sphinx enclosure are consistent with prolonged rainfall of a kind Egypt has not seen since the early Holocene, have been dismissed, but not by a counter-analysis of the fissures. Graham Hancock, the journalist whose fingerprints of the gods and later magicians of the gods have argued for a lost pre-agricultural civilization, has been dismissed, but not by a counter-account of the specific archaeological anomalies he cites, such as the site of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, a stone circle complex dated to approximately 9600 BCE that mainstream archaeology has itself struggled to explain within the conventional model of the Neolithic transition. The pattern is consistent. A researcher makes specific claims that touch on artifacts in specific museums. The mainstream response is not to engage the claims but to characterize the researcher. The reasons the pattern persists are worth naming. Academic careers are built through peer-reviewed publication in a small number of specialist journals. The editors of those journals are drawn from a small pool of specialists. If a claim falls outside the working paradigm of that pool, the claim is not easily reviewed. There is no reviewer available who considers it worth their time to read carefully. The paper is desk rejected. The claim is not addressed on its merits, because no venue exists that will publish an address on its merits. Over time, the accumulated absence of engagement becomes itself an argument. A claim that has not been engaged with in 50 years is treated as a claim that does not deserve engagement. The circularity is complete. The forensic skeptic viewer of this channel knows this pattern. It is the pattern that generates the anger. Not because Sitchin was correct. Sitchin may not have been correct on any given specific point, but because the process by which his specific points were not engaged is a process that violates the norms the academic profession claims for itself. The academic profession claims that its authority rests on the willingness to engage with specific evidence in a specific way. When the profession declines to engage with specific evidence, and instead characterizes the person who presented it, the profession's own claimed authority is undercut. This is what the audience of this channel is angry about. It is a legitimate anger. It is not an anger at scholarship. It is an anger at the failure of scholarship to be what it says it is. The Atrahasis tablets are in the British Museum. They are catalogued. They are photographable. Any Assyriologist who wishes to publish a counter-translation of the Lulu passage, showing that the pazaru verb does not bear the meaning Sitchin gave it, and showing that a different verb, or a different grammatical construction, is the correct reading, that Assyriologists can do so. The tablets are available. The vocabulary is documented. The Chicago Assyrian Dictionary is on library shelves. No one has done this. There is a further point about the dismissal that has to be made, because it is the point that most cleanly separates a fair characterization of the situation from an unfair one. The mainstream Assyriological community is not in general hostile to unconventional readings of ancient texts. It has, across the 20th century, accepted many readings that were initially outside the working paradigm. Kramer himself reshaped the understanding of Sumerian literature against significant early resistance. The reading of the Enuma Elish as a political document reflecting Babylonian imperial ideology was, in its time, an outsider reading. The recognition that the astronomical diaries preserved in the British Museum's late Babylonian collection constitute a systematic scientific record was, in its time, an outsider reading. The mainstream community has, historically, been capable of updating. What is different about the Sitchin case is not the unconventionality of the reading. It is the network of associations the reading carries. the association with the ancient astronaut hypothesis, with commercial popular publishing, with what Hallow called the tradition of Velikovsky and von Däniken. These associations, rather than the specific philological arguments, are what has determined the response. The response is to the association, not to the argument. The argument sits still unaddressed. The academic response to Sitchin's specific reading of the Atrahasis across 50 years has been essentially silence followed by dismissal. And silence is not refutation. It never has been. To understand what the Atrahasis is doing and what it is not doing, it helps to move outside the text for a while and into the world that produced it. The Mesopotamian floodplain, in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, was one of the most densely written places that has ever existed on the Earth. Something in the range of 500,000 cuneiform tablets have been recovered from its sites. Most of them are administrative: receipts, contracts, letters, ration lists, temple accounts. This is the ordinary business of a society that ran on writing. On top of that base of administrative record, the same scribes who counted sheep and measured barley produced the literary and religious texts that survive. Those texts did not sit above the administrative work. They were of a piece with it. The same scribe might, in a single day, record the delivery of 40 jars of beer to the temple of Enlil, and then copy a hymn to Enlil's wife Ninlil. The literary was not sealed off from the practical. When the Atrahasis describes the making of the human being, it does so in the same physical medium: clay, cuneiform, reed stylus, as a barley receipt. The world in which the Atrahasis was written believed in its gods in a way that is difficult for a modern reader to fully reconstruct. The gods were present. They lived in their temples. They received food and drink daily, cared for by priests who washed their statues and dressed them in specific garments. The statue of Marduk in the Sergila temple at Babylon was fed twice a day. The statue of Ishtar at Uruk was carried in procession on specified festival days. This was not metaphor. The gods were understood to be present, physically, in their images, and the priests who tended them were performing a real service that had real consequences. When a city fell to an enemy, the enemy's first act was to remove the god statue and take it home as a captive. When a god statue was captured, the city it belonged to was understood to have been abandoned by its god. The gods of Mesopotamia were, in the ordinary sense, real. Enki was one of these gods. His principal temple was at Eridu, at the site now called Tel Abu Shahrin, in what is now the Dekar Governorate of southern Iraq, approximately 300 kilometers southeast of Baghdad. His symbol was the goat fish. He was associated with water, specifically with the Abzu, the freshwater underground ocean that the Mesopotamians believed sat beneath the earth and fed the rivers and springs. He was the god of wisdom, of craft, of clever solutions to problems. In the surviving hymns and epics he is characterized as the sympathetic god, the one who cares about human beings, the one who intervenes to save them. In the Atrahasis itself, when the other gods decide to send the flood to destroy humanity, it is Enki who whispers through the reed wall of a hut to warn the man Atrahasis and instructs him to build the boat. This same Enki is the god the text describes as making the first human being. Whatever else the text is doing, it is doing it inside a religious framework in which Enki was understood as a specific being with specific attributes and specific relationships to the other gods and to human beings. The reading that treats Enki as a straightforwardly physical being, an engineer of some kind, working with materials and instruments, has to reckon with this. Sitchin's reading does reckon with it, in a way that has to be described fairly. Sitchin's position is not that the Mesopotamians were mistaken about their gods. His position is that the Mesopotamian understanding of the gods was, in its way, accurate, that the beings they described were real, that the temples were built to house real presences, that the offerings served a real purpose. His argument is that the Mesopotamians and their descendants, over the centuries in which the texts were copied and recopied, lost some of the technical understanding that the earliest text encoded. The later scribes preserved the words. They no longer understood in every case what the words had originally meant. This is a familiar pattern in the history of religion. Ritual language is preserved for centuries after the specific reference of the ritual have been forgotten. The Latin of the Roman Catholic Mass was preserved for 1,000 years after Latin ceased to be a living language, and it is only in the 1960s that the vernacular was reintroduced. The Sanskrit of the Vedas was preserved with extraordinary precision by generations of reciters who did not necessarily understand every word they were saying. The mechanical preservation of a text can outlast the culture that first understood it. If the Atrahasis is such a text preserved with fidelity across a period during which the specific reference of its vocabulary drifted, then the philological work of recovering the original reference is real work. It is the same work that has been done successfully on other ancient texts. The Rosetta Stone made possible the reading of Egyptian hieroglyphs after 1400 years, during which no one could read them. The Behistun inscription made possible the reading of Old Persian and, through Old Persian, the reading of Akkadian. The same principles that made those decipherments possible, patient work with a small number of anchors, willingness to entertain unfamiliar readings, refusal to force the text to say what the reader expected it to say, are the principles that any serious philology has to apply. Sitchin's argument is that his readings are not unfamiliar in the sense of being anachronistic. They are unfamiliar in the sense of being outside the assumptions the modern field has settled into. But the field's assumptions are not neutral. They are the result of specific choices made by specific scholars at specific moments in the field's history. The moment at which the mainstream Assyriological reading of the Mesopotamian creation myths was consolidated was, roughly, the 1930s and 40s, in the work of Kramer and his contemporaries. Those scholars were working in the aftermath of the discovery that the Sumerian language was a linguistic isolate, unrelated to any known language family, and their principal concern was to establish the philological basics. They read the texts as religious documents because that is what the surrounding evidence suggested. They were not asking the technical question that Sitchin later asked. They had no reason to ask it. Their frame produced their reading. Sitchin's frame produced his. Neither reading emerged from a neutral position. There is a further layer to this that touches on the question of what kind of knowledge the Mesopotamians actually had. The astronomical achievement of the late Babylonians in the second half of the first millennium BCE is one of the striking phenomena in the history of science. The astronomical diaries preserved in the British Museum, thousands of tablets recording daily observations of the moon, the planets, the weather, market prices, and river levels, constitute a systematic scientific record that ran for more than 7 centuries without a break. It is the longest continuous scientific record in human history. The Babylonians developed methods for predicting eclipses, for calculating planetary positions, and for measuring the length of the year to a precision that European astronomers would not match until the 17th century. This astronomical work did not appear from nowhere. It emerged from a tradition of observation that stretched back into the 3rd millennium BCE. The tablets from the Old Babylonian period preserve mathematical texts that solve problems in areas that would today be classified as algebra, geometry, and number theory. The Plimpton tablet, held in the rare book and manuscript library at Columbia University, is a table of what mathematicians now call Pythagorean triples, computed with a sophistication that suggests a mature mathematical tradition already in place by approximately 1800 BCE, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. The Mesopotamians were not, on the evidence of their surviving records, a people who separated the technical from the religious. Their mathematics was embedded in their divination. Their astronomy was embedded in their calendar, which was in turn embedded in their ritual. Their medicine was embedded in their theology. The categories the modern reader wants to apply, myth here, science there, ritual here, procedure there, did not exist for them as separated domains. This matters for how the Atrahasis is read. If the categories were not separated, then a text that reads to a modern eye as unambiguously mythological may have functioned in its original context as something that had a technical dimension. The mythological register and the technical register were not mutually exclusive. The scribe who copied the Atrahasis was, from his own perspective, doing several things at once: preserving a religious inheritance, exercising a craft, recording the acts of the gods. The modern reader who assumes that the text is only mythological is imposing a modern separation on a text that predates it. Sitchin's reading is, in one sense, a reading that refuses the separation. He reads the text as doing multiple things at once. He is not the only reader to have done this. The Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobsson, whose book Treasures of Darkness is one of the great works of 20th century Sumerology, argued throughout his career that Mesopotamian religious texts had to be read against a background of what he called the poetic imagination of the ancient Near East, a mode of thought in which the metaphorical and the literal were braided together in ways that the modern reader had to slow down to catch. Jacobson was not Sitchin. His work is firmly within the mainstream, but his methodological point that Mesopotamian texts operate in a register that is neither purely literal nor purely symbolic cuts in a direction that makes some room for readings like Sitchin's. If the register is braided, then the question of whether the Atrahasis is technical or symbolic may be a poorly formed question. It may be both. What Sitchin adds, and what makes his reading contested, is the further step that the technical dimension is not just present but recoverable, and that the specific vocabulary of concealment and staggered awakening refers to a specific procedure with a specific structure. The site of Eridu, as it stands now, is a low mound in a dry landscape. The bricks of the successive temples are visible in the archaeological trenches Fuad Safar dug in the 1940s. The lowest level, the one so far labelled Temple 17, sits on virgin soil. Above it, 16 further temple layers were built and rebuilt across a span of approximately 3,000 years. Each temple was constructed on the ruins of the last, following the same orientation, with the same interior arrangement at slightly larger scale. The continuity of the sacred site across 3,000 years is one of the most striking features of Mesopotamian archaeology. The people of Eridu remembered across 3,000 years that this specific spot was where the Temple of Enki belonged. If any memory of a specific event at this site was preserved by the community that built and rebuilt the temple, that memory had a physical anchor that persisted for the duration of the settlement. The mound is still there. It is approachable now with some difficulty because of the security situation in southern Iraq. But it has been visited by researchers as recently as the 2010s, and the archaeology remains available. The other sites named in the Atrahasis, Shuruppak, home of the flood hero, at Tel Farah, Bad Tibira, at Tel al-Madain, Larak, at a site not yet definitively identified, Sippar, at Tel Abu Haba, north of Babylon. These are also physical locations. Some have been excavated, some have not. All are accessible in principle to modern archaeology. Whatever the Atrahasis text is doing, it is anchored to a landscape that exists. It has not been in the same manuscript tradition as, say, Greek myth, which was assembled centuries later from oral fragments and cannot be tied to specific sites. It has been in a tradition that is anchored to real ground, in real mounds that can be walked. This gives the reading of the text a discipline that not all ancient texts have. If the Atrahasis says something happened at Eridu, there is an Eridu. If it says something happened at Shuruppak, there is a Shuruppak. The specificity of the geography is available for anyone who wants to check it. And this brings the reader back to the specific claim of the seven and the fifth. The claim is not that a religious text says something poetic about human origins. The claim is that a text anchored to a real site, in a real language, using a specific vocabulary of concealment, describes a procedure applied to the human being at a specific location, and that a subset of the capacities so applied were staggered in their activation across long time. The claim is testable in the sense that the text is testable. The vocabulary is what it is, the location is where it is. The staggering is either present in the language or it is not. Sitchin's argument is that it is. His argument sits open. Before returning to the specific question of the fifth capacity, it is worth pausing on one further element of the Mesopotamian intellectual world that touches on the Atrahasis directly. This is the concept of the namtar, usually translated as fate or destiny, but with a more specific meaning that the translation does not fully capture. The namtar is what is decreed at the beginning of a thing, a person, a city, a temple, an object. It is written at the moment of origin. It cannot be revised afterward, or only with great difficulty. The Mesopotamian gods, in the recurring literary scenes of divine assembly, are frequently depicted as sitting together to fix the namtar of newly created things. The namtar of the human being was, according to the Atrahasis, fixed at the moment of the lulu's making. Whatever was written into the human being then was written for the duration. If the Mesopotamians understood this concept in something like a technical sense, it would explain a great deal about the language of the Atrahasis, a namtar that is fixed at origin, that is written into the thing, that cannot be revised except by a divine act. This is not obviously different from the modern concept of a genome. The genome, as understood since Watson and Crick's structure in 1953 and Franklin's crystallographic work that made it possible, is a fixed writing at the moment of origin that determines what a being can and cannot do, and that cannot easily be revised. The Mesopotamian concept of Namtar and the modern concept of genome are not identical, but they are, on this specific question, not as different as one might expect. The point is not that the Mesopotamians knew about DNA. The point is that they had a working concept, a Namtar, that mapped a certain space. When a modern reader encounters the language of Namtar in the Atrahasis, the reader has to decide what to do with it. Sitchin's choice was to press on the semantic overlap and ask what would follow if the ancient concept were closer to the modern concept than the standard translation suggests. The framework fits the vocabulary. Whether the framework was in the mind of the original scribe is a further question, but the vocabulary as it stands can carry the framework. There is a further Mesopotamian corpus that touches on this and has been much less discussed than it should be: the Shurpu and Maklu rituals, incantation series preserved on tablets from the Library of Ashurbanipal. In several Shurpu incantations, the ritual specialist addresses a class of beings called the Igigi, distinct from the Anunnaki, described in the Atrahasis as the gods who worked before the human being was made. The Igigi appear in these rituals as beings who oversee the human from a distance, and who can be invoked to release the human from a fixed state. If the Atrahasis describes a fixed writing at origin, a Namtar, the Shurpu incantations describe a set of monitoring functions that operate on that writing. This is inference, it is not proof. But the alternative, that the ancient scribes wrote language whose structure has no coherent referent, is a stronger claim, and one that requires more work to defend than the reading that treats the language as referring to something. There is finally the question of what the Mesopotamians thought about time. The seven-capacity, staggered awakening reading depends on an ancient conception of time in which future events can be scheduled and read from the past. The Mesopotamian conception of time was, in fact, unusually structured. It was cyclical at multiple scales: the day, the month, the year, the reign of a king, the age of the world, and each scale was readable through the appropriate technical discipline. That the Mesopotamians would encode a scheduled event across long time in a text preserved for centuries in a specific temple archive is entirely consistent with what they did in other domains. A scheduled event embedded in a text, awaiting the moment of its own activation, is an idea that fits their intellectual world closely. Whether it fits the specific text of the Atrahasis is the question Sitchin asked. His answer was yes. The pattern of 7 staggered capacities, embedded at origin and activating across long time, is not unique to the Mesopotamian record. It appears, with strikingly parallel structure, in a text tradition that developed on the other side of the Asian landmass, under conditions in which no ordinary channel of transmission from Mesopotamia can be plausibly proposed. This is the Vedic tradition. The oldest of the Vedas, the Rig Veda, was composed in Sanskrit somewhere in the Indus and Sarasvati river regions of what is now northern India and Pakistan, in a period conventionally dated between approximately 1500 and 1200 BCE. That is roughly contemporary with the later phases of the Mesopotamian tradition. The Rig Veda was transmitted for approximately 1,000 years by oral memorization before it was first written down, with a fidelity of transmission that modern linguists have been able to verify by comparing widely separated reciting lineages that agree to the syllable. In the Rig Veda, and more explicitly in the later Upanishads that developed the Vedic thought into philosophical systems, appears a specific doctrine that has to be described carefully. The doctrine is the doctrine of the koshas, usually translated as sheaths, and the chakras, usually translated as wheels or centers. The Taittiriya Upanishad, one of the oldest of the principal Upanishads, dated approximately 600 BCE, enumerates 5 sheaths of the human being: the Annamaya or food sheath, the Pranamaya or breath sheath, the Manomaya or mind sheath, the Vijnanamaya or discernment sheath, and the Anandamaya or bliss sheath. These are described as concentric layers, each subtler than the last, each present in the human being from origin, but not fully accessible until specific conditions of practice and development are met. In the later tantric texts, this structure of layered sheaths becomes elaborated into the system of 7 chakras, 7 centers arranged along the axis of the body, each corresponding to a distinct capacity of consciousness and function. The number is 7, the staggering is by capacity, the activation is understood to occur in sequence, from the base to the crown. The parallel with Sitchin's reading of the 7 Anunnaki embedded capacities is not exact. The Vedic system is a system of practice. The Sumerian system in Sitchin's reading is a system of scheduled activation, but the structural correspondence is real. 7. Layard, present from origin, staggered in activation. This is the same architecture. The Vedic and Sumerian traditions are usually treated as independent developments. The Indo-European language family that produced Sanskrit is distinct from the Semitic language family that produced Akkadian, and both are distinct from the language isolate that is Sumerian. The archaeological evidence for direct contact between the Mesopotamian and Indus Valley civilizations exists but is limited. Some carnelian beads found in Mesopotamian graves, some cuneiform references to a place called Meluha that is generally identified with the Indus Valley. There is no evidence that the Indus Valley civilization received the Atrahasis, or that the Mesopotamians received the Proto-Vedic material. If a structural parallel of this specificity appears in both traditions, the parallel is either coincidence, or it reflects a shared inheritance from a common source deeper in time, or it reflects the same underlying phenomenon being observed independently by two intellectual traditions. The choice between these three options is a choice about how to weight the evidence. The parallel does not stop with the Vedic material. In the Book of Enoch, a text preserved in Ge'ez in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon and in Aramaic fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls, dated to approximately the 3rd century BCE, there appears a specific catalogue of what the fallen watchers, the Irin or Grigori, taught to the human beings. The Book of Enoch names them and enumerates their teachings. There are 7 of them named in the earliest layer of the text: Semjaza, Azazel, Armoros, Barakel, Kokabel, Sariel, and Ramuel, each associated with a specific class of knowledge that was transmitted to humanity at a specific moment. The pattern is 7 again. The class of knowledge is staged and specialized. The transmission is described as an event, a specific historical intervention that changed what human beings could do. The Ethiopian and Aramaic versions of Enoch preserve this account with variations, but the 7-teacher structure holds. The Book of Enoch was excluded from the canonical Hebrew Bible and from most later Christian canons, but it circulated widely in the first centuries of the Common Era and is quoted directly in the New Testament Epistle of Jude. The Yoruba tradition of West Africa, transmitted through the Ifa divination corpus, preserves an account of the origin of humanity in which a specific Orisha, Obatala, the god of the white cloth, shapes human beings from clay. Obatala is described in the Afar literature as having received the ace, a Yoruba concept usually translated as spiritual power or authority, in a specific configuration from the supreme deity Olodumare. The Ifa corpus is arranged into 256 chapters called Odu, but the 7 senior Odu are treated as the foundational configuration from which the rest derive. The senior 7 map, in some readings, to a set of embedded human capacities that unfold across a life and across historical time. The Ifa tradition is oral. It has been recorded in the 20th century by anthropologists including William Bascom, and more recently by Yoruba scholars working within the tradition. The tradition itself is understood by its practitioners to be extremely old, though its dating in the modern academic sense is uncertain. In North America, the Hopi creation account describes 4 previous worlds, each of which was destroyed, and each of which contained a distinct configuration of human capacities. The current world is the 4th. There are 7 prophecies traditionally associated with the Hopi elders that describe the conditions under which the 5th world will begin and what capacities it will require. The Hopi material is oral, guarded by initiated members of specific clans, and only partially available in the anthropological record. But the structural parallel is present, a sequence of staged worlds, a 5th that is approaching or has recently begun, and a set of capacities associated with each. The Popol Vuh, the Kichi Maya creation text preserved in a 16th century transcription of an older tradition, describes 4 attempts by the gods to create beings capable of praising them. The first attempt produced animals, the second produced beings of mud, the third produced beings of wood, the 4th produced human beings from maize. Each stage failed in a specific way. Each stage embedded a specific capacity that the next stage completed. The number 4 in the Popol Vuh does not directly correspond to Sitchin's 7, but the structural principle of staged and cumulative creation, in which capacities are embedded at successive attempts, is again present. What is common across these traditions on any generous reading is the intuition that human beings are staged. that there are capacities present in the human that are not immediately active, that the activation is scheduled rather than random, that the schedule is tied in different ways in different traditions to cosmic cycles, to divine intervention, to the practices of a specific culture, or to the arrival of specific moments in time. If one intuition were present in one tradition, coincidence would be the natural explanation. When the intuition appears across Sumerian, Vedic, Hebrew apocryphal, Yoruba, Hopi, and Maya traditions, in independent locations, in mutually inaccessible languages, using different symbolic vocabularies, the argument for coincidence has to do more work. The conventional academic explanation that these are all instances of the same broad archetypal pattern that emerges naturally in human religious imagination is available. It is not implausible. But it is not, either, obviously more explanatory than the alternative, which is that the underlying phenomenon is real and was independently observed. The choice between explanations depends on how much weight is given to the specificity of the structural parallels versus the plausibility of an underlying phenomenon that would give rise to them. Reasonable readers can disagree. What cannot reasonably be denied is that the parallels exist. They are not vague. They involve the same number, the same architecture, the same staging, the same association with cosmic scheduling. The forensic skeptic viewer of this channel, who cross-references against Vedic, Ge'ez, Yoruba, and Maya sources, will find that the parallels hold up on inspection. This is not one tablet. It is a pattern. The strongest objection to everything that has been argued so far is one that has to be presented in its full force before it can be answered. It runs like this. The parallels across cultures, Sumerian, Vedic, Hebrew, Yoruba, Hopi, Maya, that seem to converge on a seven-staged architecture of human capacity are not evidence of a common underlying phenomenon. They are evidence of the way the human mind works. The number 7 is favoured across cultures because 7 is roughly the limit of items that a human working memory can hold at once, a result established by the psychologist George A. Miller in his 1956 paper, The Magical Number 7, ± 2. Any culture producing a classification of anything will tend, without external cause, to arrive at approximately 7 categories. The staged architecture of embedded capacities is favoured because human development itself is staged. Infancy, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, maturity, and any culture reflecting on human development will tend to notice this and formalize it. The association with cosmic scheduling is favoured because agricultural societies are pattern-detecting societies that look for meaning in the sky, and the sky offers cycles at multiple scales that any observant tradition will map onto human affairs. On this reading, what has been called a parallel is not a parallel to a shared underlying event. It is a convergent output of similar cognitive architectures reflecting on similar existential conditions in similar ecological contexts. The number 7 is where you would expect classifications to land. The staging is where you would expect frameworks to land. The cosmic scheduling is where you would expect meaning-making to land. To argue from these to a specific ancient intervention on the human genome is to overinterpret patterns that are already sufficiently explained by ordinary cognitive science and comparative anthropology. This is the strongest version of the objection. It is a serious objection. It has to be granted a large part of what it claims. Human minds do converge on similar structures. Human cultures do produce similar classifications. Convergence is not proof of common ancestry, and convergence is certainly not proof of the specific ancestry Sitchin proposes. Where the objection is weaker is on the specific vocabulary. The Miller argument, and the developmental argument, and the pattern detection argument can explain why cultures produce structures with 7 elements, staged activation, and cosmic association. They do not, however, explain why the specific vocabulary of concealment, the pazaru verb in Akkadian, its analogues in the Hebrew apocryphal tradition, the guya concept in Sanskrit that means the same thing, recurs across these traditions attached to the same architectural element. Cognitive convergence explains the shape. It does not explain the vocabulary. It does not explain why, in each of these traditions, the specific verb used to describe what happened to the embedded capacities is a verb of hiding rather than a verb of, say, ordering, or arranging, or scheduling, all of which would fit the pattern equally well, but none of which the traditions in fact use. The specific choice of the concealment vocabulary is the residue, after the cognitive convergence explanation has done its work. It is what remains unexplained. The state of the debate on this specific point is, honestly, unresolved. There is no consensus position, because the specific point has not been engaged at the level where a consensus could form. The mainstream Assyriological reading treats the pazaru vocabulary as a stylistic feature of Mesopotamian religious language. The Sitchin-derived reading treats it as a technical feature of the specific procedure the text describes. Both readings are at present defensible. Neither has been decisively established. The countercase does not defeat the central thesis, but it substantially limits how strongly the central thesis can be asserted. The most that can honestly be said is that a specific vocabulary of concealment recurs across a set of ancient traditions, that it is attached in each case to a staged architecture of human capacity, and that the parallel is difficult to fully account for on cognitive convergence grounds alone. Whether the residue is best explained by an underlying real event of the kind Sitchin proposed, or by some other mechanism that has not yet been proposed, remains genuinely unresolved. It is the state of the question. It is where the record leaves the reader. If the central reading is substantially correct, even partially, even in a diluted form, then a small set of specific things about how the ancient world is understood would need to be revised. The classification of the Atrahasis and its companion texts as purely mythological documents would need a subcategory for procedural content. The reading of the pazaru verb in the Lulu passage would need to be reopened as a philological question, with a fresh translation attempted by specialists who took the technical possibility seriously. The chronology of the Sumerian king list would need to be reconsidered, not as literal in the strict sense, but as preserving a memory of durations that the mainstream reading dismisses too quickly. The connection between the Mesopotamian Namtar concept and the modern conception of a fixed writing at the origin of an organism would deserve a serious comparative study which has not yet been undertaken. The site of Tel Abu Shahrain, the ancient Eridu, would deserve renewed attention as the location the text specifically names for the fashioning of the first human being. The parallels across Vedic, Hebrew apocryphal, Yoruba, Hopi, and Maya traditions would deserve a comparative analysis that treats the specific convergences on their own terms, rather than dismissing them as coincidence. And the question of the fifth capacity, and whether anything specific is happening in the current era that would count as its activation, would remain, as it has been for approximately 50 years, a question that the record leaves open. None of these revisions would overturn the working scholarship of Assyriology as a whole. They would extend it. They would ask it to hold two readings of the same text simultaneously, neither confirmed, both taken seriously. The artifact is real, the vocabulary is documented, the parallels are traceable, the specific question is open. What it means, if it means anything, is not for the script to settle. The reader has the sources, the reader can check. The Atrahasis tablets are in the British Museum, in the Mesopotamian Gallery, with duplicates and fragments in the Old Babylonian collection and the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The Sumerian king list is in Oxford, in the Ashmolean Museum, where it has been since 1922. The Nippur ME lists are in Philadelphia. The Book of Enoch is in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon and in the Aramaic fragments held with the Dead Sea Scrolls collection. The Taittiriya Upanishad has been continuously transmitted in the Vedic reciting lineages for approximately 26 centuries. The Popol Vuh sits in the transcription first published by Francisco Jimenez in the 18th century, with critical editions available in modern Spanish and English. Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet in 1976 and Genesis Revisited in 1990. His books are in print. The tablets are on their shelves. What Enki was described as embedding into the Adamu, and what the fifth of those embedded capacities is doing now, if anything, is still open. It has been open since Layard dug the tablets out of the ground in the 1850s. It is still open now.